r/NoSleep. My first night shift at a diner on the outskirts had its own terrifying rules. Living on the outskirts of a small town in Nebraska was a curse I'd been trying to escape. Endless fields, rustling corn stalks, and dirt roads made for a dull existence. With a few $100 to my name, I needed work fast. I didn't care what kind of job it was, anything to earn enough to get out of this ghostly place. My old truck rumbled along the back roads as I scanned for signs of life. That's when I saw it, a neon sign flickering in the distance. It read Eddie's Diner, and below it, a handwritten help wanted sign taped on the window. The diner itself was a relic from the 60s, with chipped paint and a parking lot barely big enough for 4 cars. I walked inside, greeted by an old jukebox playing some dusty country song. The air smelled of grease and faint cigarette smoke, though no one was smoking. A woman behind the counter, maybe in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a name tag that read Marge, beckoned me over. "Looking for work?" she rasped, her voice like sandpaper. "Yes, ma'am. Saw the sign out front," I replied. She glanced me up and down, eyes lingering on the calluses of my hands and the worn-out boots on my feet. "Well, we need someone for the graveyard shift. Pays minimum, but you won't have to deal with much. Just keep the place clean, serve a few stragglers. Think you can handle that?" I nodded eagerly. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Just one thing. Read these rules, and don't come back here crying if you can't handle them," she said, sliding a small, crumpled booklet across the counter. The pages were yellowed and dog-eared. I flipped it open, and my eyes landed on the handwritten rules. Rule 1, if a man in a brown hat enters between 1:30 a.m. and 2 a.m., do not speak to him. Serve him black coffee and wait until he leaves. Rule 2, if the jukebox starts playing Blue Moon on its own, turn it off immediately. Do not listen past the first verse. Rule 3, the back door must remain locked between 2:15 a.m. and 4 a.m. If you hear knocking during these hours, ignore it. Rule 4, if you find a silver dollar on any table, take it to the storeroom and place it in the locked box marked Lost and Found. Do not keep it, no matter how tempting. Rule 5, the phone may ring twice at 3:03 a.m. Do not answer it. If it rings a third time, say, "All clear," and hang up. Rule 6, if a child enters the diner alone after midnight, watch their reflection in the window. If their reflection doesn't move, lock yourself in the storeroom until 4 a.m. Rule 7, always, and I mean always, keep the salt shaker filled and within reach. Marge watched me read, a humorless smirk tugging at her lips. "Still interested?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, masking my unease with a smile. I signed some paperwork and returned the booklet. "When do I start?" "Tonight," she said, her eyes darting to the darkening sky. "Be here by 11:45. And remember, follow the rules." The diner at night was a different beast. The hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder, almost alive. The clock ticked steadily as I checked my supplies, salt shaker full, back door locked, phone unplugged just in case. Midnight came and went without incident. I wiped down the counter and stared at the emptiness beyond the windows. At 1:32 a.m., the bell above the door jangled, and in stepped a man wearing a weathered brown hat. His eyes were hidden under the brim, and his movements were slow, deliberate. Rule 1 flashed in my mind. I grabbed a mug, poured black coffee, and placed it in front of him without saying a word. He sat in the corner booth, sipping quietly, not looking at me once. The minutes dragged on, the silence almost unbearable. At 1:59 a.m., he stood, nodded at me, and left a silver dollar on the table. I froze. Rule 4. Grabbing the coin with trembling fingers, I made my way to the storeroom. It was cramped, with old cans of soup and faded boxes stacked high. On the middle shelf sat a box marked Lost and Found. I placed the coin inside, the click of the lock echoing louder than it should have. Back at the counter, a new sound sent a shiver down my spine. The jukebox whirred and sputtered, then clicked as Blue Moon started to play. Rule 2. I lunged for the off switch, heart pounding as the first verse slipped into the air. The song cut out mid-note, and the silence was a relief that left my ears ringing. I slumped into a chair, eyes darting nervously. 2:15 a.m. hit, and a knock sounded at the back door. Just one knock, then a pause. Another, more insistent this time. My pulse raced as I clenched the edge of the counter. Rule 3. Ignore it. The knocks turned to pounding, each one rattling the window panes. I bit my lip, praying they'd stop. And then they did, leaving a void of silence that somehow felt worse. A small shadow appeared in the parking lot, shifting under the dim light. I squinted, and my breath caught in my throat. A child, no more than 8, stood by the entrance. Rule 6. Watch their reflection. The bell chimed as the child pushed the door open, their small feet padding against the linoleum. I stared at the glass, watching the reflection. My heart sank as the child's body moved, but their reflection stood frozen, eyes wide and mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, heart racing, and locked myself in the storeroom. The hours crawled by with the sound of my own panicked breathing for company. Outside, muffled giggles and soft footsteps circled the diner, but I dared not move. When 4 a.m. finally struck, the noises stopped, and a strange calm settled over the diner. I emerged, sweat-soaked and shaking, but alive. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Marge walked in, eyeing me knowingly. She lit a cigarette and smirked. "Survived your first night, huh? It only gets weirder from here." I nodded, throat dry and pulse still racing. One thing was clear, this job was more than just a way out of town. It was a fight for survival. And quitting? That wasn't an option. Extend the story. Final length of story should be twice as of now, and story should be complete, no cliffhangers and scary. Continue from here. It was a fight for survival. And quitting? That wasn't an option. The sun's weak morning lights landed through the diner's grimy windows, casting long, pale shadows across the linoleum floor. I watched Marge as she stubbed out her cigarette and started the morning routine with practiced indifference. I hadn't slept, my body still thrumming with adrenaline from the night's events. The rules echoed in my mind, each one more sinister than the last. "Take it easy today," Marge said, her voice low. "You'll need the rest." She didn't wait for a reply as she disappeared into the kitchen. I couldn't shake the feeling that those last few hours of the night had been a test, and I had barely scraped by. I spent the next few days in a haze, alternating between exhaustion and paranoia. The town's quietness felt suffocating, like an unseen presence watching from just beyond the fields. The second night shift started the same way. The air inside Eddie's diner grew heavier with each tick of the clock, and the list of rules seemed to whisper to me from its crumpled pages, daring me to test them. Midnight rolled by uneventfully, and I busied myself with cleaning up the counters and sweeping the floor. At 1:15 a.m., the hum of the jukebox caught my attention. It was almost imperceptible at first, just a soft whirring, but it set my nerves on edge. I glared at it, waiting for any sign of movement. The moment passed, and the jukebox remained silent. I exhaled shakily, only to be startled by the sharp clang of the bell above the door. My head snapped up, and I saw him again, the man in the brown hat. His entrance was as silent as before, his eyes still hidden beneath the brim. The clock read 1:32 a.m. I followed Rule 1, pouring him a cup of black coffee without a word. This time, he took a seat at the counter instead of the booth. My hands trembled as I set the mug down in front of him, and he raised a gloved hand in a silent gesture of thanks. The next half hour was a study in tension. I kept glancing at him from the corner of my eye, the silence between us pressing down like a physical weight. At 1:59 a.m., he stood, placing another silver dollar on the counter. I stared at it for a moment too long, and when I looked up, he was already gone. The air where he had sat felt colder, a chill sinking deep into my bones. Rule 4, I reminded myself. I scooped up the coin and walked it back to the storeroom, the lock clicking shut over the heavy box. As I stepped out, the diner fell into darkness. The fluorescent lights sputtered, dimmed, and died, leaving me bathed in the faint glow of the neon sign outside. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for a flashlight beneath the counter. The beam cut through the shadows, dancing across empty booths and faded walls. A soft knock echoed from the back door. My breath caught. Rule 3. This time, it wasn't a single knock or a set of 3. The knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was mimicking a heartbeat. Each thump reverberated in my skull, driving me to the edge of panic. "Ignore it," I whispered to myself, clenching my jaw. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, from the front of the diner, the jukebox sputtered to life. The opening notes of Blue Moon drifted out, soft and mournful. Rule 2. My pulse quickened as I moved to the machine, my fingers brushing the off switch just as the first verse began. "Blue Moon, you saw me standing alone." The song cut off with a hiss, but the silence it left was worse. A chill swept over me, raising goosebumps along my arms. I backed away slowly, eyes darting to the window. Something moved outside, A shadow gliding across the parking lot. It was the child again. This time, they stood closer, their face turned toward the glass. My knees weakened as I watched their small form move inside, the bell above the door chiming weakly. I kept my eyes on the reflection, heart pounding. The child's reflection stared back, unmoving, with eyes wide and empty. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence, high-pitched and hollow. "Mister, can I have some water?" Rule 6. I swallowed hard, inching backward. The child took a step forward, their real body moving, but the reflection still frozen in that silent, open-mouthed scream. I reached the storeroom and slammed the door shut, locking myself in. The room felt suffocatingly tight as I pressed my ear to the door. The soft giggle came again, closer now. Tiny fingers raked across the outside of the storeroom door, and I bit back a cry. The minutes dragged into hours, each second marked by the scratching sound. The doorknob rattled once, twice, and then fell silent. The bell chimed again, signaling the end of the visitor. I waited, muscles tense and breath shallow, until the first rays of dawn painted the walls with pale light. Cautiously, I opened the door and stepped out. The diner looked the same, as if nothing had happened. The salt shaker was still full, the counter clean. Marge walked in a few minutes later, eyebrows raised at the sight of me. "Still here, huh?" she said, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled up around her head like a halo. "Guess you're made of tougher stuff than most." "What happens if I don't follow the rules?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Marge's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You don't want to know, kid. Trust me." She turned away, heading for the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The days blurred into nights, and the diner's strange visitors became a twisted routine. The man in the brown hat, the child's laughter, the ringing phone, each encounter tested my resolve, gnawing at my sanity bit by bit. One night, just after 2:15 a.m., the phone rang. Once, then twice. I stared at it, the urge to answer clawing at me. On the third ring, I picked it up, heart racing. "All clear," I whispered and hung up. The diner fell silent. For the first time, I thought I heard a voice, not outside, but inside my head. It whispered things I couldn't understand, each syllable sending shivers down my spine. I glanced at the salt shaker, now inexplicably empty. Panic rose as I realized I'd broken Rule 7. The lights flickered, the air thickening around me. A shadow pooled in the corner of the diner, growing and shifting, as if something unseen was crawling out from the darkness. Marge's voice echoed from the kitchen, sharp and urgent. "Get the salt, now." I scrambled for the storeroom, hands shaking as I grabbed a new shaker and ran back. The shadow loomed, reaching toward me with tendrils that crackled with cold. I scattered salt across the floor, the grains catching the dim light. The shadow recoiled, hissing as it melted back into the dark corners. Breathing heavily, I looked up to see Marge standing in the doorway, eyes narrowed. "Told you it only gets weirder," she said. I nodded, wiping the sweat from my brow. This job was more than just work, it was a battle between the mundane and the monstrous, a fight to keep whatever haunted Eddie's diner at bay. But one thing was certain, I was determined to survive the graveyard shift, rules and all.